Well, it's great to be here with you all, to be one of the many tesserae in the mosaic that makes up our Zendo community here today. And I was thinking about that tesserae and how, what if that's the picture of happiness? Or what if that's the picture of grace? Maybe it's the mosaic of our true home, our true place. So it's nice to make up that tesserae with you. The process of sort of choosing a topic for a talk is sometimes a little bit fraught for me, particularly during session, particularly during in-person session. I don't know, because kind of going all the time, and everything's racing through my mind, and all these ideas and all these examples, and how do I put it together, and then how do I throw it out so then I can just come at it naturally. And at any rate, when the theme of the session came up and I was asked to give a talk, I had a real natural candidate for a talk. I recently have been getting audiobooks from the library for free, and I got my wife got me an audiobook about Ernest Shackleton. And in walking my dog, I've been listening to Ernest Shackleton, and he was a sailor, and it seemed appropriate for a boat without oars, moving through the moonlight. I turn my head and I see the water weeds on the shore, on the ancient shore still. I didn't know it, but Shackleton was the 11th most important Brit. He's not even Brit. He was born Irish, but raised in England, voted by, I don't know, Times of London poll or something like that. The first is Winston Churchill, and then the second is, of course, Princess Di, and Shakespeare's in there, and John Lennon's in there. He was the last great explorer in the Antarctic. And his third expedition left in 1914, just weeks after the beginning of the Great War. And he went down into the Arctic, and what he was to do was to cross over the South Pole, go from one side of the Antarctic to the other, and he had another boat coming around from the other side, which was to lay supplies. So once he got to the North Pole, then he would have a supply line for the second half. It's a very cold winter in the southern climes, and the Endurance, which was the name of his ship, got stuck in the ice. And they were stuck for about 9 or 10 months. And then the ice began to heave up, and it cracked their ship in half. Their ship sunk. And they had to exit the ship with 50 sled dogs, which they were to use to go across the pool, and a year's of supplies. And they were now on the ice with 3 small boats. And Shackleton decided to try to go overland when it was clear that the expedition was off and it was now survival, and to haul with the dogs the boats, the 3 boats. But in the Antarctic ice, the pressure ridges, and the ice comes up huge, 30, 50 feet high, They had to go up and down. And so they made about a mile a day, and they had hundreds of miles to go. It was clear they couldn't do that. There was a saying that if you wanted speed, you called Roald Amundsen, who got to the South Pole first in 1911. If you wanted scientific instrumentation and measurement, you called Scott, who died in 1911. He arrived at the South Pole 2 weeks after Amundsen, and he starved to death on his way back. If you're in trouble, you call Shackleton. They ran out of food and they had to hunt seals and penguins, skin them, eat them. They ended up killing and eating their dogs. Terrible, because they had become very attached to the animals. The 28 men readied the boats for when the ice would break up. And then the ice was moving north, and they got into the water, and they sailed for 5 days in open boats, some boats 12 feet long, some 20 feet long. Big waves, seas, Arctic ice, spray, snow. They got to this island, Elephant Island, and found they couldn't stay there, had to move around the island. And then Shackleton decided he had to take the 20-foot boat and go 700 miles, because Elephant Island, there was nobody there, 700 miles to get help. So they outfit the boat and they go 700 miles, an unbelievably miserable journey. And while I'm reading this, I'm thinking, this is, in some ways, this is a good metaphor for my life. The heroic view. And he gets to South Georgia Island, and he's on the wrong side of the island. And they had just survived a hurricane. And so he climbs 32 miles over the island, a climb that had never been accomplished and wouldn't be accomplished again for 30 or 40 years, and finally gets help. And the ships come and save various groups that are scattered around. And the 28 men live and make their way back to England. But in choosing this as a story, as exciting as it is, and I really recommend the book, Endurance, is somehow it felt separate from me. It was sort of Shackleton's journey, and how could I plug into that boat? Maybe it was the great way knows no difficulty. Maybe it was some of the quotes that Hinton shared with us, Mencius. The 10,000 things are there in me, and there's no greater joy than looking within and finding myself faithful to them. Maybe we're not separate from the Arctic or Antarctic. Maybe perseverance, maybe a noble cause. We heard the word noble cause, noble, a couple of days ago. Maybe it's a noble thing we do here. But still, it felt kind of hard for me as a talk. And then yesterday morning, we were getting ready to sit at 6 a.m. And I went to plop down on my cushion, and I heard a voice inside me that said, "You must first bow to your cushion." So I got up and bowed to my cushion. And that voice was actually the voice of my first teacher, who taught me Zen, really, when I was very young. when I was in high school. And with that bow, I knew I had my Shackleton. I knew I had my talk, because it wasn't something out there, something in here for me. And it was fun to hear Allison talk about, just give us a nod yesterday with regard to sort of the noble cause of taking up Zen, in high school. But it wasn't really very noble. It was, we were kind of sitting around and someone says, "Do you got a car?" And I say, "No." And I say, "Do you got a girlfriend?" And they say, "No." Are you applying to college next fall? No, not me. I'm barely graduating. Well, let's become Zen Buddhists then. And we did. That's how it happened. And Robert A. King was, he was a Spanish teacher. He wasn't my Spanish teacher at our school, but he hosted us. And we would get up at, I think it was 4:30 in the morning. And I'd meet the truck. I'd meet Dana's truck very early, and I'd either hop in back of the truck, or if it was cold, we'd all six of us cram into the cab, and we'd go and we'd double clutch up the hill. That means you gotta hit the clutch twice, because your transmission's not very good. It's a very steep hill to get up to Bob King's. We called him Señor King's house, where we would sit for an hour and a half. And it was a wonderful experience. It was a beautiful view of Mount Diablo, the Diablo Valley out in Walnut Creek, and to the south, the Las Trampas Range, and to the west, the Berkeley Hills. Green in the springtime and wintertime, like now after rains. Dry and yellow in the summer. Señor King was half Filipino and half, I don't know what else. I think his father was Jewish, but I never once heard him mention his father. His mother was a medical doctor, Filipina, Spanish blood, I guess, he always said. And in 1940, when he was about 8 or 9, she divorced her husband and decided to take them back to the Philippines. So he's back in the Philippines when he was 8 or 9, 10. And then in 1941, December 7th, you recall, of course, Pearl Harbor. Well, the Japanese attacked all around the Pacific on that exact same day. And they attacked Manila. They took over Manila within a month or so. And conditions must have been really poor in the occupation because there was so much resistance. Very harsh. 500 Filipinos died in the Japanese occupation. Hundreds of thousands of those must have been in Manila, where he lived. And he contracted poliomyelitis as a child. And he must not have gotten care because it wasted his legs. And as an adult, he needed braces to walk. And if he didn't have braces, he used crutches. So when we sat Zazen together, he would have his braces off and he'd swing with his crutches, and then he'd plop down on a chair and he'd go in full lotus. And he was a powerful person. He really worked on his ki, his chi. He did some real deep breathing. And he once showed us almost like a parlor trick. He said he used to breathe through his feet. And when we were all sitting around one time, he took out a match and he held out his arm and he lit the match underneath him, under his arm, and just held it there until the match burned out, and it didn't burn his skin. And he said his chi was flowing. His chi was flowing. And the Zen we did was, in some ways, kind of comic book Zen, you know. We sat around, the six of us, and five guys, and then later Polly came, who I texted last night for further information. She says, "Tell me how it goes." Bob King is still an inspiration in my life, she says, almost 50 years later. And we would sit facing the wall, and we were encouraged to shout "cots" once in a while if we were so inspired. So once in a while we'd go "cots," and he'd carry the stick around, and we'd sit and then walk, sit, maybe a short talk, a little bit of tea. I can still taste the tea. The tea is genmai cha, which is a roasted whole brown rice and tea. And used to make it, I can still smell it. And I can still hear the wind at the top of the hill, the dawn wind zendo, rustling the shades. I can still, as I mentioned, see the view out to the south, the Las Trampas Mountains. And though it was a little bit, it seemed a little comic bookish, it actually was good Zen. Because if you don't know anything and you just read the instructions on back of the Bisquick box and you just follow the instructions, you'd be surprised what happens. I remember I was talking to my brother explaining the Zen we were doing, and I said, well, I said a very strange thing. I said, well, Dan, it's like how a flower grows. And I went like that. And all of a sudden I knew how a flower grows. It grows like that. And one time we were in we had a one-day retreat, and I was looking down at the highway. You could see the highway from his house. And every car at every moment was exactly in the right place. And later that day, he played just the sound of a train, just sounds, It's our last period of meditation. And the train went by. It was so beautiful a sound. Tears came down my cheeks. And he was good. He introduced me to Zen Center Los Angeles, Maizumi Roshi. He had started sitting with Mel Weitzman in San Francisco at the Bush Street San Francisco Zen Center back in the mid-60s. And then he had met So Kyung-bo, who was a Korean master, famous in Korea. I later visited him, and very plugged in, and just a beautiful calligrapher. In fact, David Parks has a copy of his calligraphy in back of him, and Jan Black has I know I've seen her calligraphy by So Kyung-bo. So I started to go down to Sesshin at Zen Center in Los Angeles, and so I'd sit extra. I'd sit extra like at lunch, sat in lunch before I went to Sesshin for a few weeks before or something, a month before. I was sitting there, and I remember there's some kids outside making a little bit of noise. I was sitting in Señor King's uh, room, Spanish room, empty, of course. And, oh, that's what they mean by emptiness. Emptiness is just a word. You can't really touch it, but somehow it's like a movie screen upon which a movie is projected. And the movie is our lives, and the screen is something that makes our lives possible. And, not a big deal. Every little bit of awakening, though, is all of awakening. And I've never forgotten that. So the Zen we did was real. It was real, and it was sincere, and it was energetic, and it was creative. It was crazy. He was a crazy man. Sometimes just start laughing just wildly, ha 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 ha. And we couldn't help but start to laugh with him. It was beyond bizarre. And yet he was a really well-respected teacher. He was voted Teacher of the Year twice. Like, I don't know who votes for Teachers of the Year. He was a disciplinarian too. There was another Spanish teacher, McDonald. Everybody tried to take advantage of him, and Señor King would go in the room, and he had a very gnarly cane, and he'd just glare at everybody with his cane like that. He just looked, and the room was silent, and he'd walk out. And so after, I don't know, a year and a half, we sat together, and our group sort of held together, and then we scattered off in the winds north and west, and then all over the place. And I didn't lose touch with him. I occasionally sent him a postcard, but pretty much for the next 10 years, 15 years, I was not in town. Well, when I wrote my mother, I wrote Señor King, 105 Hillcroft Way, Walnut Creek, California. And I guess he had a couple more students. But he had a falling out with So Kyung-bo, the Korean. And he had this big pile of just gorgeous calligraphies. And he burnt them all. More bitter than Dawi. Remember when Dawi burnt the Blue Cliff record? Or Deshan, remember when he burnt his commentaries? This was bitterness. And there was that side to Señor King. There was the love and the heartfelt, but there was darkness there, which he never let us see, and which he never really dealt with. And maybe for good reason. What atrocities could he have witnessed as a child? He would never run in a baseball game. He could barely walk. He was a solitary boat passing through the moonlight. He was not married. And we could tell that there was a deep, deep sadness there. And he was a poet, and he knew Nanao Sasaki, as mentioned, and he knew Gary Snyder very well. In fact, I have every poetry book that Gary Snyder ever wrote because uh, Señor King bought them all, and I was in his will to receive all of my Taoist and Buddhist books, which I did. And I distributed some of them to friends. And one friend said, "Oh, the book you sent me, I smell it, and it smells of incense. Decades of burning incense in his library." It's beautiful. But his poetry, I never really cared for. And I got out a book of his poetry last night, and I started going through it, and I realized the reason I never really cared for it is because it was never dark. There was no shadow. There was no shadow in it. Let me read just an example, if I might. Beautiful, samadhi bright, lots of ki, lots of chi, but maybe the integration, you know. It's called Laughing Zen. Laughing Zen, this deepest Zen meditation, this ongoing, joyful, total, immovable, deep, ever-moving stillness. Laughing Zen, deepest Zen meditation. Each moment, laughing Zen, ha, ha, he, ha, hoi, kots. I don't know, maybe a little bit, you know. How about a tear, you know? He worked, he tried to work on it. It was big, you could feel it. We never talked about it, but it was big. How, knowing myself, accepting myself, being comfortable with myself, bright sun, desert sky. My Buddha nature, how, liking myself, accepting myself, compassionately, not too difficult, bright sun, desert sky. My Buddha nature, how, ultimate, unbreakable, diamond-like Zen meditation, yielding, unyielding strength, flowing, caring, loving, passionate, compassionate, ultimate, unbreakable, intuitive Zen awareness, prajna wisdom, my diamond-like Zen subtle breathing, belly universe, bright sun, desert sky, me in nature. That's a kind of a wonderful explanation, you know, life. He was alone. He was alone a lot. Though after he died, I found out that he was very tricky in that he would cultivate, you know, separate silos, if you will, of friendship. and so, and so when we had a memorial service for him, which I ran it was about 5 years ago when he passed away. There's about 25 people there, people from school, people, you know, his former students who he kept in touch with, his neighbors who would always have him over for Thanksgiving. And I had him over. We had him over for Christmas, but he began to decline. At any rate, when he was still, I think in his 40s, maybe his early 50s, he hooked up with a former student. And I don't know if you can feel, he was a great lover of EQ, so I have to apologize for the R rating here, but after Zazen, talking, remembering, holding each other, kissing tenderly, understanding each other so sensitively, being one, remembering, our loving, flowing, freely, gentle, melting, delighting our hearts, bodies, remembering. You lying down, your naked, gentle beauty there, remembering. Kissing your eyes, hair, breast, delighting in your thighs. Between them, the gateway to life, radiating the universe, remembering. Lying down beside you, your caresses, unforgettable, fierce gentleness, remembering. I think that didn't last, you know. I think it was probably a short affair, but it was a deeply, deeply important friendship for him. And you can tell by his poetry, yes, yes. It's not explaining, you know, it's doing. You're in the boat. Why is it that a clearly enlightened person can't cut the red thread? Lying down with you in bed, you know, isn't that lovely? So we kept in touch for many years, and I would talk to him. I would go visit him once or twice a year and call him up. Or he called me for a lot of years. He was proactive. He called me once a month and we'd talk. And interesting, when I went and see him, there was some magic to it still. There was a stoplight at the bottom of the hill, and coming off his road, which is called Boulevard Way, not important, but there was a stoplight, and there was a much busier road north-south, Mount Diablo Boulevard, and most of the traffic was going north-south, getting right on the freeway, 95% of the traffic. And I counted, I started to hit green lights coming to that light. And I counted actually 16 different times straight where I got a green light. And then I visited him, and he was ill. I got a red light. And I got some red lights in visiting him. And when he passed away, I started getting green lights again. But he declined, and over the years slowed down, and he had a recurrence of his polio. It came back, and then he couldn't walk even with braces or anything, and he had to get a helper for 3 or 4 hours a day. And the helper was Filipino, and so they could talk Tagalog and that sort of thing. Arnell was his name. He was really sweet man. For years, Arnell was there. But the house that Bob was in, that Señor King was in, was never painted, never changed, and it just got older and older and older. And the bathroom got a little grubby, and I used to take my kids there. Not so much because he was a good kid person, but I just wanted my kids to see my life, you know. But, you know, he was in bed, and it wasn't a good environment to bring visitors. So I'd go and I sit on a chair next to his hospital bed, which he now had. And it was quick visits, always quick visits. He'd be watching CNN, and he'd sometimes mute it, sometimes not. How's your kids? How's Lynn, your wife? How's your brother Dan? How's his son? How's John Tarrant? Every time. Oh, John Tarrant's doing fine. He's good. In fact, one time I rolled Señor King into my car, and we went up and we saw John, and we visited John and Joan out in West County, right near her house. Joan Sutherland's house was at the top of the mountain. You could look down into the ocean. Really beautiful, and he really enjoyed that visit. And it was one of the few visits that we took together. So he was beginning to decline. It was clear, and he had gotten cirrhosis of the liver, though he never drank, and kept going to see him. And then I got a call from one of his caregivers, a guy named Dr. Lido, who wasn't a medical doctor, he said. And he said that that Señor King had passed away. In the year or two before he passed away, I would buy him, I got him these gifts, at Christmas time and New Year's. You buy Harry and David, and they'll send fruit wherever you want once a month, fruit of the month from all over. And then they send you an email that your fruit arrived at its destination. And so it was a good opportunity for me to call him on a monthly basis and say, how is the fruit? How are the oranges? How are the pears? And he said, fine. And he shared them with his caregivers. But he was hilarious. Whenever I took him cookies, he would there were like 6 cookies in a bag. He'd just sit there and eat all the cookies at one time, watching CNN with us. And the last time I saw him, it was a short visit. It was going to be a short visit. There were always short visits. The chats on the phone were short, 30 seconds. And he looked at me when I was about to say goodbye, and he looked at me, and his eyes were just watery and huge. And I could tell he wanted me to stay longer. So I did. I held his hand, and we didn't say anything. And then I left. So I got a call from Dr. Lido, and said that Bob had died. Señor King had died. And that he didn't want to call me beforehand. But his caregivers had taken the cherries that had arrived that month. For some reason, I didn't call him this time, which was unusual. But they had taken the cherries and they had mashed it up. They'd fed him the cherries in the day and the hours before he died. And he seemed to enjoy that. Yeah, so it's been 5 years, and I think of him when I bow to my cushion. Let me see if I can share a screen. Host disabled participant sharing. What time do we have? We got 33. So we're only 33 minutes in. Can I be made a co-host? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Share screen. Share. Why can't a clear-eyed bodhisattva cut the red thread? Why can't a person of great strength lift their leg, take off their braces, and lift their leg? Yeah, it's not in the explaining, is it? It's in the living. You lie down in bed next to me. I think you could tell by his poetry, he's working, Yeah. How is it that a clear-eyed, or why is it that a man of great strength, a Spanish teacher of great strength, can't lift up his leg? Yeah. I mean, yeah. his shadow, from the very beginning, shadow and light were not different, right? You can't draw a line. And so maybe his shadow was shining with a kind of a beauty and a light that we can all appreciate. It's not about becoming perfectly balanced. Maybe it's just about, I don't know. I'm coming to understand him better with time.
I'm great, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just fine.
I just wanted to say I had the privilege of doing end of life care for my grandfather. I was raised by him. He was my dad. He was also a Southern Baptist minister, and 6'4", World War II combat veteran, powerful farmer, loud, screaming, charismatic Baptist minister. And I remember how much I looked up, the teachings, everything as a teacher. And I remember the first time he was ever on a cane after his stroke. And I grew up poor, and my gift for getting to high school was some blue jeans. And my grandfather took me to go get blue jeans. And as he sat in the Walmart, the little bench there in front of the men's restroom at Walmart, and I helped him up for the first time, and I felt his skinny frame, the fragility and the strength at the same time. And it was so beautiful to be able to share that. And even as he got older and he could no longer use the restroom, and I would hold him with both arms while he peed and help him pull his pants up. Um, so beautiful, and so painful at the same time, to be able to see someone. Because how is it that someone with so much strength can no longer get up to use the restroom? And and I carry that with me. So thank you, John. Beautiful, beautiful talk today.
Well, let's leave it at that. So thank you very much.